Greenland is often imagined as a vast, frozen wilderness at the edge of the world, remote, silent, and untouched by global politics. But history tells a very different story. Far from being an isolated land of ice, Greenland has quietly become one of the most strategically important territories on Earth. In the 21st century, as global power shifts northward toward the Arctic, Greenland stands at the center of a new geopolitical struggle, one that explains why the United States is increasingly desperate to secure influence over this massive island. To understand why Greenland matters so much today, we must first understand what it truly is. Greenland is the world's largest island, covering more than 2 million square kilometers, 3 times the size of Texas. Nearly 80% of its surface is covered by ice, yet beneath that ice lies something far more valuable than snow or glaciers. Greenland sits astride the shortest air and missile routes between North America and Europe, controls access to emerging Arctic shipping lanes, and contains untapped reserves of rare earth minerals, oil, and gas. Despite its size and importance, Greenland has a population of fewer than 60,000 people. Politically, it is an autonomous territory of Denmark, but geographically, culturally, and strategically, it belongs to the Arctic world, an arena where major powers are now competing openly. The United States' interest in Greenland is not new. In fact, American leaders have been watching the island for more than 150 years. As early as 1867, the same year the U.S. purchased Alaska, American officials debated whether Greenland should be acquired as well. At the time, the idea was dismissed as impractical. The world had not yet entered the age of air power, nuclear weapons, or intercontinental missiles. Greenland's true value had not yet revealed itself. That changed during World War II. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in 1940, Greenland was suddenly exposed. The United States, fearing German expansion into the North Atlantic, stepped in. American forces built airstrips, weather stations, and supply bases across Greenland, effectively turning it into a forward operating platform long before the Cold War even began. These early military installations laid the groundwork for what would become one of America's most critical overseas defense positions. After the war, the strategic importance of Greenland only increased. The Cold War transformed the Arctic from a frozen frontier into a potential battlefield. The shortest route for Soviet bombers or missiles targeting the United States ran straight over the North Pole and directly across Greenland. In response, the U.S. constructed Thule Air Base, now known as Patuxent Space Base. It became a key node in America's early warning radar system, designed to detect incoming nuclear attacks. This base was not symbolic. It was essential. Greenland became a shield, an early warning tripwire standing between Washington and Moscow. During the height of the Cold War, American military planners understood one truth very clearly: whoever controlled Greenland would control the Arctic sky. But when the Cold War ended, many believed Greenland's strategic value would fade. Instead, the opposite happened. Climate change began to melt Arctic ice at unprecedented rates. New shipping routes started to emerge, cutting weeks off travel times between Asia, Europe, and North America. The Arctic seabed, once unreachable, became accessible. Suddenly, Greenland was no longer just a military outpost. It was a gateway to future global trade and resources. This transformation triggered a new race for influence in the Arctic. Russia rapidly expanded its Arctic military presence, reopening Soviet-era bases and deploying new icebreakers. China, though not an Arctic nation, declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in polar research, infrastructure, and mining projects across the region, including in Greenland itself. For Washington, these developments were alarming. China's interest in Greenland's rare earth minerals, essential for advanced electronics, renewable energy, and military technology, raised red flags inside the Pentagon. The idea that a strategic rival could gain economic leverage over an island sitting between North America and Europe was unacceptable to U.S. planners. Greenland was no longer just about defense. It was about supply chains, technology, and long-term global dominance. In 2019, this hidden struggle burst into public view when then-President Donald Trump openly suggested that the United States should buy Greenland. The world laughed. Headlines mocked the idea as absurd. Denmark called the proposal ridiculous. But behind the laughter, defense analysts understood something crucial: the proposal was not a joke. It was a signal. The United States was acknowledging openly what it had understood privately for decades: Greenland is too important to ignore. This desperation does not come from ambition alone. It comes from fear of losing strategic depth, technological advantage, and early warning security in a world where the Arctic is no longer frozen shut. As ice melts, power flows north. And Greenland sits at the center of that flow. To understand why Greenland has become so valuable, we must first understand its geography. Geography is destiny in global politics, and few places on Earth demonstrate this truth more clearly than Greenland. Sitting between North America and Europe, directly beneath the Arctic Circle, Greenland occupies one of the most strategically decisive positions on the planet. It is not merely land, it is a platform, a bridge, and a gatekeeper to the Arctic. Greenland's location places it directly along the shortest air and missile routes between Eurasia and North America. In military terms, this makes it a natural early warning zone. Any aircraft or missile launched from across the Arctic must pass near or over Greenland. For decades, this reality shaped U.S. defense planning, making Greenland an indispensable part of American homeland security. But geography alone is not what triggered today's renewed urgency. What truly changed Greenland's role was ice. For thousands of years, Greenland's massive ice sheet acted as a natural barrier, locking away its interior and surrounding seas. That barrier is now melting. Climate change has transformed the Arctic faster than any other region on Earth. Each year, Greenland loses hundreds of billions of tons of ice, exposing land, coastlines, and seabeds that were once unreachable. This melting has unlocked what many analysts now call the Arctic Gold Rush. Beneath Greenland's ice lies an extraordinary concentration of natural resources. Geological surveys suggest that Greenland holds vast reserves of oil and natural gas offshore, as well as critical minerals inland, especially rare earth elements. These minerals are essential for modern civilization. They are used in smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, advanced weapons systems, satellites, and stealth technology. Today, global supply chains for rare earths are dangerously concentrated. China controls a majority of the world's production and processing capacity. This dominance gives Beijing enormous leverage over global technology markets and military supply chains. For the United States, reducing dependence on China has become a strategic priority, and Greenland offers one of the few viable alternatives. Greenland's mineral wealth includes neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and uranium, materials essential for high-performance magnets, guidance systems, and energy infrastructure. Access to these resources could reshape global power balances, which is why foreign interest in Greenland has intensified so rapidly. But minerals are only part of the story. As Arctic ice retreats, new maritime corridors are opening. Routes that were once frozen year-round are now navigable for longer periods. These Arctic shipping lanes dramatically shorten travel distances between Asia, Europe, and North America. A cargo ship traveling from East Asia to Europe can save up to 2 weeks by passing through Arctic waters instead of the Suez Canal. Greenland sits directly along these emerging routes. Whoever influences Greenland gains leverage over future global trade flows. Ports, refueling stations, search and rescue hubs, and monitoring infrastructure built on or near Greenland could shape the rules of Arctic commerce for decades. This is not theoretical, it is already happening. China has attempted to invest in Greenlandic airports, ports, and mining projects. While these investments were presented as purely economic, Western intelligence agencies viewed them differently. Infrastructure in the Arctic is never just civilian. In a region where logistics are scarce, every runway and port has potential military value. Concerned by this trend, the United States stepped in quietly but firmly. American officials pressured Greenland's government and Denmark to block certain Chinese projects. Washington also increased diplomatic engagement, reopened consulates, and expanded military cooperation, moves designed to anchor Greenland firmly within the Western security sphere. From the Pentagon's perspective, losing influence in Greenland would be catastrophic. The Arctic is no longer a frozen buffer. It is becoming a front line. Russia has already militarized large sections of its Arctic coastline, deploying missile systems, radar networks, and air bases. Russia's Northern Fleet operates from Arctic ports, giving Moscow nuclear second strike capability beneath the ice. If Russia controls the eastern Arctic and China gains economic footholds in the western Arctic, Greenland becomes the last major anchor point for U.S. power in the far north. This reality explains why Washington views Greenland not as a distant territory, but as a critical extension of North American defense. Even space is part of this equation. Greenland's high latitude makes it ideal for satellite tracking, space surveillance, and missile detection. Modern warfare depends on space-based systems, and control of polar ground stations is essential for monitoring orbits and detecting launches. This is why the U.S. has expanded the role of Patufic space base beyond traditional radar, integrating it into America's space defense architecture. In this new era, Greenland is no longer defined by ice and isolation. It is defined by access to resources, trade routes, data, and strategic positioning, yet this transformation carries risks. Greenland's fragile environment is extremely vulnerable to industrial activity. Mining, drilling, and shipping threaten ecosystems that have sustained Inuit communities for centuries. As foreign powers compete for influence, Greenlanders themselves face a difficult question: how to balance economic opportunity with sovereignty, culture, and environmental survival. That question lies at the heart of Greenland's future. The Arctic was once seen as a frozen buffer zone, a place too harsh, too remote, and too inaccessible to become a serious arena of global conflict. That assumption is no longer true. Today, the Arctic is transforming into one of the most competitive regions on Earth, and Greenland lies at the center of this transformation. To understand why the United States feels increasingly desperate to secure its position there, we must examine the growing presence of two rival powers, China and Russia. This is not a future conflict. It is already unfolding. For Russia, the Arctic is a core national priority. Nearly 20% of Russia's GDP is tied directly or indirectly to Arctic resources. Its northern coastline stretches across more than half of the Arctic Ocean, giving Moscow geographic advantages unmatched by any other nation. Over the past decade, Russia has rebuilt and expanded dozens of Soviet-era Arctic bases, installed advanced air defense systems, and deployed new missile platforms capable of operating in extreme polar conditions. Russia's Northern Fleet, headquartered in the Arctic, is its most powerful naval force. It includes nuclear-powered submarines armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles, forming a critical component of Russia's nuclear deterrence. From beneath Arctic ice, these submarines can strike targets across the globe. Greenland's location places it directly along the routes used to monitor and counter this capability. For American defense planners, this makes Greenland indispensable. China's approach is different, but no less concerning to Washington. Although China has no Arctic territory, it has declared itself a near-Arctic state. This designation has no basis in international law, but it reflects Beijing's long-term strategy. China views the Arctic not as a regional space, but as a global commons, one where influence can be gained through economics, infrastructure, and science rather than military force alone. Over the past decade, China has invested heavily in polar research stations, satellite monitoring systems, and icebreaker fleets. It has proposed a Polar Silk Road, integrating Arctic shipping lanes into its broader Belt and Road Initiative. Greenland, with its resources and strategic position, fits neatly into this vision. Chinese companies have sought stakes in Greenlandic mining projects, particularly those involving rare earth elements and uranium. They have also shown interest in airport construction and port development, projects that, on the surface, appear civilian but could easily support dual-use capabilities. This is where alarms began ringing in Washington. The United States has learned, often painfully, that infrastructure investments can translate into long-term strategic leverage. Ports can host naval vessels. Airports can support military airlift. Telecommunications infrastructure can enable surveillance. In the Arctic, where infrastructure is scarce, control over even a single facility can shift the balance of power. As a result, the U.S. began actively blocking Chinese involvement in Greenland. Diplomatic pressure was applied behind the scenes. Financial alternatives were offered. When Greenland planned to expand several airports, American officials intervened to ensure Chinese firms were excluded. These actions were not symbolic, they were defensive. From Washington's perspective, Greenland is not just another investment destination. It is a red line. At the same time, the United States has been forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. It had neglected the Arctic for decades after the Cold War. While Russia built icebreakers and China built influence, American Arctic infrastructure stagnated. Greenland suddenly became the most viable anchor point for reasserting U.S. presence in the region. This urgency explains the dramatic shift in American rhetoric and policy. Greenland hosts critical early warning systems that are part of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. These systems monitor missile launches and track objects in space. As hypersonic weapons and space-based threats become more advanced, Greenland's role in detection and response becomes even more vital. Hypersonic missiles travel at speeds and trajectories that traditional radar systems struggle to track. Detecting them early requires forward position sensors, and Greenland is one of the few places where such sensors can operate effectively against Arctic-based threats. This is why the U.S. has expanded its military investment at Patuxent Space Base. The base is no longer just about Cold War-era bombers. It is about space warfare, missile defense, and real-time global surveillance. For China and Russia, this makes Greenland a strategic obstacle. Neither Beijing nor Moscow can directly challenge U.S. control of Greenland militarily without triggering massive escalation. Instead, their strategies focus on erosion, gradually reducing Western dominance through economic pressure, diplomatic engagement, and technological competition. Russia challenges NATO's freedom of movement in the Arctic. China challenges Western supply chains and investment dominance. The result is a slow-burn rivalry that resembles the early stages of the Cold War, but in a far more interconnected world. This rivalry places Greenland in a dangerous position. Unlike during the Cold War, Greenland is no longer a passive territory. It has its own government, its own political aspirations, and its own public debate about independence. As global powers compete for influence, Greenland must navigate offers of investment, security guarantees, and diplomatic pressure, all while preserving its autonomy. For the United States, losing Greenland to rival influence is not an option. For China and Russia, weakening U.S. dominance, there would be a strategic breakthrough. This is why Greenland has become a focal point of great power competition. Quiet, calculated, and relentless, the Arctic may look calm on the surface, but beneath the ice, a new Cold War is taking shape. In the next part of this documentary, we will turn our focus inward, examining Greenland's own people, political evolution, and growing push for independence, and how their choices could reshape the balance of power in the Arctic. In every discussion about Greenland's strategic value, there is one perspective often overlooked: the perspective of Greenlanders themselves. Beneath the ice, beyond the military bases and mineral surveys, Greenland is home to a people with a distinct culture, language, and political identity. As global powers compete for influence, Greenland's future will ultimately be shaped not in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow, but in Nuuk. Greenland's population is overwhelmingly Inuit, known as the Kalaallit. Their ancestors have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, adapting to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Hunting, fishing, and deep knowledge of ice and sea have shaped Greenlandic culture and identity. For centuries, Greenland existed largely outside global power struggles, until colonialism changed everything. In the 18th century, Denmark established control over Greenland, integrating it into the Danish kingdom. For much of this period, Greenland was governed as a colony, with limited political rights for its indigenous population. Economic activity was tightly controlled, and decisions were made in Copenhagen rather than locally. This began to change in the second half of the 20th century. In 1979, Greenland achieved home rule, granting it authority over many internal affairs. This process accelerated in 2009, when Greenland adopted self-rule, formally recognizing Greenlanders as a people under international law and transferring control over most domestic policy areas to the local government. Today, Greenland manages its education system, healthcare, natural resources, and local economy. However, Greenland is not fully independent. Denmark still controls foreign policy, defense, and monetary affairs. It also provides an annual financial subsidy that makes up a significant portion of Greenland's public budget. This financial reality sits at the center of Greenland's independence debate. Many Greenlanders see independence as the natural next step in their political evolution. The desire to control their own destiny, resources, and international relationships is strong, especially among younger generations. Yet independence carries risks. Greenland's small population and limited economy make it vulnerable to external pressure. This vulnerability is precisely what global powers are watching. For the United States, Greenland's political trajectory is a strategic concern. Washington officially supports Greenlandic self-determination, but its actions reveal a more cautious stance. Full independence could open the door to foreign investment and influence, particularly from China. If Greenland seeks new economic partners to replace Danish subsidies, this creates a delicate balancing act. The U.S. wants Greenland to be autonomous enough to cooperate directly with Washington, but not so economically vulnerable that it turns to strategic rivals. As a result, American engagement in Greenland has increased in non-military areas, education exchanges, economic development programs, infrastructure funding, and diplomatic presence. In 2020, the United States reopened its consulate in Nuuk after decades of absence. This move was symbolic, but also practical. It signaled long-term commitment and allowed Washington to engage directly with Greenland's government and society. Denmark, meanwhile, finds itself in a complex position. As Greenland's former colonial ruler and current sovereign partner, Denmark must balance respect for Greenlandic autonomy with its own security responsibilities. Denmark is a NATO member and relies heavily on U.S. defense cooperation in the Arctic. At the same time, Copenhagen faces domestic pressure to acknowledge historical injustices and support Greenland's right to self-determination. This triangle, Greenland, Denmark, and the United States, is central to Arctic stability. China's role complicates matters further. For Greenlandic leaders seeking economic independence, Chinese investment can appear attractive. Mining projects promise jobs, revenue, and infrastructure development. But these offers come with long-term implications, accepting large-scale foreign investment risks creating economic dependency. Infrastructure built with foreign capital can limit political flexibility. Greenland's leaders are acutely aware of these risks and have debated them openly in parliament and public forums. Environmental concerns add another layer of complexity. Greenland's economy depends heavily on fishing, and its ecosystems are extremely fragile. Mining and drilling threaten wildlife, water systems, and traditional ways of life. Several proposed mining projects have sparked protests and political backlash, forcing governments to weigh short-term economic gains against long-term environmental and cultural costs. This internal debate reveals a critical truth: Greenland is not simply a prize to be claimed. It is a society negotiating its future under immense external pressure. For the United States, this human dimension matters more than it may appear. Any attempt to exert control over Greenland without local support would backfire politically and morally. Washington understands that influence must be built through partnership, not coercion. This is why U.S. policy emphasizes respect for Greenlandic autonomy, indigenous rights, and environmental protection, at least rhetorically. Whether these commitments hold under increased geopolitical pressure remains an open question. Greenland's leaders are keenly aware that global attention brings both opportunity and danger. Strategic relevance can attract investment, security guarantees, and diplomatic leverage. It can also invite interference, manipulation, and loss of control. The independence question remains unresolved, not because Greenland lacks ambition, but because the stakes are extraordinarily high. As climate change accelerates and Arctic competition intensifies, Greenland's choices will shape not only its own future, but the balance of power in the North Atlantic. The island that was once ignored is now impossible to overlook. In the final part of this documentary, we will examine what lies ahead, whether Greenland becomes a zone of cooperation, a flashpoint of rivalry, or a carefully managed sphere of influence in a rapidly changing world. Greenland's transformation from a remote Arctic territory into a central piece of global strategy raises a critical question: what happens next? As ice retreats and attention intensifies, Greenland stands at a crossroads, one that will define not only its own future, but the future of Arctic stability itself. The choices made in the coming decades will determine whether Greenland becomes a zone of cooperation, a theater of rivalry, or a carefully managed sphere of control. For the United States, the stakes could not be higher. Greenland is no longer viewed merely as a Cold War relic or a distant ally's territory. It is increasingly seen as a core component of American homeland defense, space security, and global influence. As emerging technologies reshape warfare, hypersonic weapons, space-based systems, and cyber capabilities, the importance of Arctic positioning grows. From Washington's perspective, maintaining influence in Greenland is about prevention rather than expansion. U.S. officials fear a future in which rivals gain leverage over Arctic infrastructure, supply chains, or surveillance systems. In such a scenario, America's strategic depth would shrink, and its early warning advantages could erode. This explains why U.S. engagement in Greenland is likely to deepen, not necessarily through overt control, but through long-term partnerships. Denmark's role will also evolve. As Greenland's autonomy grows, Denmark faces a gradual redefinition of its relationship with the island. Copenhagen has publicly acknowledged Greenland's right to eventual independence, but remains deeply involved in defense and foreign affairs. In practice, Denmark functions as both partner and intermediary, linking Greenland to NATO while advocating for its interests within Western institutions. This arrangement may not last forever. If Greenland chooses independence, it will inherit enormous responsibilities: defense coordination, diplomatic alignment, and economic sustainability. These challenges make it unlikely that Greenland will pursue a sudden or complete geopolitical realignment. Instead, most analysts expect a slow transition, one that preserves close ties to Denmark, NATO, and the United States. Yet independence would also bring new temptations. As Arctic resources become more accessible, Greenland will face increasing offers of investment, trade, and infrastructure development. For a small economy seeking financial independence, these offers can be difficult to refuse. This is where the influence of China becomes most significant. China's long-term strategy favors patience. Rather than military confrontation, Beijing relies on economic integration, scientific cooperation, and commercial presence. If Greenland were to open its doors too widely, Chinese firms could gain durable influence, shaping local economies, labor markets, and political incentives over time. The United States understands this risk well. It has watched similar patterns unfold in other regions of the world. This is why Washington increasingly frames its Greenland policy around sustainable development and trusted investment. The message is clear: Western support is available, but alignment matters. Russia's future role will likely remain more confrontational. For Russia, the Arctic is inseparable from national identity and military strategy. Moscow will continue to assert its presence along its northern coast and challenge NATO activity near its borders. Greenland's proximity to key Russian operating areas ensures it will remain a focal point in this rivalry. Even if direct confrontation is avoided, the danger lies not in open conflict, but in miscalculation. As more military assets, surveillance systems, and commercial vessels enter Arctic space, the margin for error narrows. A navigation incident, an intercepted aircraft, or a misunderstood military exercise could escalate rapidly in a region where communication is difficult and response times are long. This is why some policymakers argue that cooperation, not competition, is the only sustainable path forward. Greenland could play a stabilizing role here. As a territory deeply affected by climate change and external pressure, Greenland has a vested interest in keeping the Arctic peaceful. It participates in regional forums, scientific collaboration, and indigenous networks that emphasize shared stewardship over confrontation. Institutions like the Arctic Council, though limited, offer frameworks for dialogue. Scientific cooperation on climate, navigation safety, and environmental protection remains one of the few areas where global rivals still work together. Greenland's involvement in these efforts reinforces the idea that the Arctic does not have to mirror other conflict zones. Still, cooperation has limits. Strategic competition is already embedded in Arctic planning documents, defense budgets, and infrastructure projects. Even as nations speak the language of collaboration, they prepare for rivalry. Greenland exists within this contradiction, benefiting from attention while bearing its risks. The future of Greenland will not be decided by a single event or agreement. It will unfold gradually, shaped by climate trends, economic choices, political leadership, and global power shifts. One thing, however, is already clear: Greenland is no longer invisible. The island that was once dismissed as a frozen wasteland has become a strategic keystone of the modern world. For the United States, controlling influence in Greenland is about safeguarding the future. For global rivals, it represents opportunity. For Greenlanders themselves, it is a test of sovereignty, identity, and resilience. Whether Greenland becomes a model of balanced cooperation or a symbol of unchecked competition will depend on choices made today, quietly, incrementally, and often far from the public eye. In the Arctic, history is no longer frozen, it is moving, faster than ever.